I'm so glad that you're all, thanks, Joshua. So glad that you're all here. My name is Lee Watts, he, him, they, them. I'm with the Multnomah County Domestic and Sexual Violence Coordination Office. My image description is I'm a white person with short brown hair and glasses with black frames. I'm wearing a plain black sweater, and my background is a colorful image with purple and teal granite texture for DV Awareness Month and teal for Sexual Assault Awareness Month, with the letters SAAM for Sexual Assault Action and Awareness Month 2023 over my left shoulder. During this presentation, please put any questions in the chat or raise your virtual hand at any time during the training. You can find the button along the bottom to raise your hand under reactions. It's an icon with a happy face and a plus sign. Click on that and you will see the bar-shaped button to raise your hand. For technical assistance, you can direct message me, Lee Watts, or Joshua Quantz, who's Multnomah County IT, helping us out today in the chat. If you're not speaking, please turn your camera off. If you want to change the way you see the speakers, go to the upper right-hand corner of your screen and click on the button that says View. From there, you can choose to view the active speaker in a larger screen, or you can view it in gallery mode where everyone has the same size square. You can also choose in that box to hide the people who have their cameras off, so only the speakers are visible. To view the closed captions, you can select the closed caption option from your Zoom menu bar along the bottom. It is a button that has a CC on it, and then select Show Captions to see the captions. During this presentation, we may be discussing things that could be hard to hear, and we encourage you to do what you need to take care of yourself around that. This training is sponsored by the Sexual Assault Advisory Committee and the Domestic and Sexual Violence Coordination Office, DSVCO. And again, thank you so much for being here this morning. I'm going to hand it over to our fabulous moderator, Cecilia, to introduce themselves and begin the training.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to see so many people here. My name is Cecilia Wolfe. I use they, them pronouns. I'm a white person with dark hair pulled back today, wearing a burnt orange button-up shirt and sitting in a beige room with a metal bookcase behind me filled with books and long vines from some plants. And I previously worked at the Sexual Assault Resource Center in Washington County, as well as Call to Safety in Multnomah County, and have stepped away from the work to get some graduate school education. And I'm excited to be here today. We'll try to plan about a 5-minute body break at about 1 hour, or whenever we're feeling like we're sufficiently through some of the questions. And I'll keep an eye on the chat as well as to see who has hands raised. Like Lee said, you're welcome to share questions as they're coming up throughout the presentation. And with that, I'll turn it over to our fabulous panel members today and ask them to introduce themselves with their names, their pronouns, organization and role, and a brief image description. And Lex, would you mind if we started with you?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. My name is Lex Crawford, she, they pronouns. I am the Training and Outreach Coordinator at Clackamas Women's Services in Oregon City. My image description, I am a white person with kind of short brown hair. I have on clear framed glasses and I'm wearing a deep yellow shirt. My background is blurred, but you can, there are aspects of a tan door and blue walls and a green plant and a filing cabinet behind me.
Lex. Lindsay, do you want to go?
Awesome, I can do that. Hi, everybody. My name is Lindsay Spaulding. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the prevention health educator over at CARES Northwest. I am a white guy with red hair and a red beard and brown eyes, and I've got my headset on. And behind me is a window with a lot of light and a cat tree that may hopefully hold a cat. Who knows? That's me.
Thanks, Lindsay. Martina, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, and I really hope that we get to see some cats today. I am Martina Shabram, she, her pronouns. I am the Executive Director at Sexual Assault Support Services in Lane County. My image description, so I am a white femme person with long red hair. You can see my background is just a white room with some stuff on the walls, some pictures and some embroidery, and a plant in the corner.
Excellent. And Eli, could you close us out for introductions?
Yeah, hello all, good to be with you. My name is Eli Cox. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the Abuse Prevention Coordinator at the Oregon Sexual Assault Task Force. My image description is I'm a white man with shoulder-length brown hair, red beard, it's the Irish in me, and I also am wearing a pink short-sleeve button-up shirt, and I also have the blurred background to hide all my cardboard boxes and other house junk that resides in the room with me here. And then my potential pet maybe showing up today is I have a couple sleeping mice who are hanging out next to me. So at some point they like to come out and play, but we'll see if they wake up. It's kind of their nap time now, but really glad to be with you all.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone. The first question to set the tone for the conversation is, can you talk about something in prevention work that's bringing you hope right now?
I'll break the ice. Something that I was thinking about that brings me a lot of hope is seeing how much our community is really starting to get excited about prevention. I do mostly adult education around violence prevention. And so seeing so many people from not just social service industries, but just kind of normal, quote unquote, community members out there really wanting to get involved and caring so deeply about survivors. The care that the community is showing in all of the things that we're doing is really incredible, and it gives me a lot of hope for our communities being safer one day, but also knowing that we're not just the only ones doing the work, that folks out there around us are also learning and doing the work too.
I'd love to jump in next. We're kind of just following the order of the introductions, and that's okay. I think what's bringing me hope right now is, I am doing prevention within the child abuse field now, but I have a long history of doing it within domestic violence and sexual violence work. And in my time of doing violence prevention for about eight-ish years, it's always been really like alone. Like I've kind of been one of the only people doing it, or maybe I had one other person helping me do it. And maybe sometimes I had other community partners that were also doing prevention, but not always. And what's making me excited lately about prevention is that we're starting to come together and really break down those silos, which is great, especially after the isolation of the pandemic and all of our organizations trying to work through that. I'm just feeling really hopeful about the fact that we are seeing similar root causes for different forms of violence, right? Whether it's sexual violence, domestic violence, child abuse, sex trafficking. A lot of these have these similar root causes, and we really could be working together. So I know what's bringing me hope is partnering more and bringing those movements together, because they do come from very, very different backgrounds. So bringing that together and making the most of the work that we can do and learning from each other. I think both child abuse prevention can really learn from what domestic violence and sexual violence prevention has done, and vice versa. And so there's so many lessons there, and you don't have to be alone doing the work, which is really nice.
Oh, those are such hope-inspiring answers, even for me in this moment. That's giving me hope. I would say I just so agree with what you two said, and I'm also thinking that one of the things that's giving me hope in prevention work right now is just seeing the ways that young folks and youth leaders are like just taking a lot more leadership and being given space to demonstrate the leadership that they were already doing. Prevention is not just about youth, obviously, but it is really wonderful to see the ways that, perhaps one of the outcomes of the turmoil of the last few years is that we're paying a lot more attention to kids when they're saying like, things aren't okay, they need help, and that they are the experts in their own experience. And I'm seeing a lot more spaces really trust young people as the experts in their own experience. And that is really deeply hope inspiring for me.
Yeah, and adding, and really want to echo all those pieces that were said. I think something that has been really hope-provoking for me as of late has been increased, what I guess I would say maybe community recognition of all the ways that community supports, really foundational supports that are needed in our communities, whether that's food, connection to community, housing, and the huge role that that plays in our overall prevention landscape. Previously, years past, I worked with folks who were doing Head Start, for example. They would come to me and say like, oh, we're so glad that you are doing prevention in our community. We so need this. And like, so often my response is like, and I am like returning that gratitude to you because I am so glad you are doing prevention in our community, because the role that you are playing is huge and foundational. And it's with all those combined roles, and especially getting to recognize how much everyday folks are really bringing and supporting to make it so it's like this comprehensive blanket that will get us further to where we're wanting to go. So I'm seeing a lot more community partners starting and just folks within the community recognizing their role, that what they do really does matter, and it adds up to our overall missions.
Thanks for sharing all of those things. And I can already see threads connecting from the hopes that you've just named to some of the questions that we have coming up later, which is great. Can you share some of the questions or concerns that come up the most in your prevention work, and how do you or your agencies address them?
I can jump in on this one. I think one of the things that I'm seeing the most in conversations with other folks, whether it's community members or community partners, is the long-term nature of prevention is so ambiguous. And so folks are like, how do I know that this is making the difference? And this is just like a common question and concern that we've gotten over the whole time that prevention has existed. But even still now, one of the biggest things that I'm facing is that question of how can you, in the short term, have some wins and also prove that this is working in a long-term way, especially when I'm doing work with youth, right? Like Martina said, not all prevention's with youth, but when we're working with youth, how can I prove that they'll grow into adults who don't hurt other people is a very big and difficult question. And so, I mean, obviously, like I just mentioned, I think one of the ways that I often counter it is there's a lot of short wins that are there, that are present, that we can factor into prevention that hopefully contribute to that long-term thing. And there's so many, I mean, we all know prevention is incredibly complicated because there's so many factors in a person's life that leads them to making certain decisions. And we all are people who may be harmed and may cause harm, right? And so every day, every environment we're in shapes that. And so I think building in those early wins and explaining to folks, like when we're able to make safer communities or healthier communities, the short-term impact is that folks feel maybe more comfortable disclosing violence, or that we're able to support each other's basic needs better, right? And so even if the long-term violence prevention isn't proven or evidence-based perfectly as we hope to be, or wish it could be, there are so many good wins that are contributing to our community that also matter. And I think that's also the beauty of partnering with people who see prevention, like Eli said, seeing prevention as so much more than just talking about violence, but all these other things that like contribute you may not think about, like food scarcity and like all these other issues that exist. I was just in a meeting yesterday where we were talking about that. So yeah, that's just one of those concerns that often comes up for me.
I would so agree with Lindsay about that concern. We get that a lot too, of well, education isn't the only answer. And we're like, yes, of course it's not the only answer. But we've kind of transitioned into, when we're talking about our all of the factors of domestic and sexual violence in our training we offer, we've kind of pivoted a little bit to really looking at like frameworks societally, and looking at how, like, if the rhetoric that has been since, forever, but if we can point directly back to, the 1600s and laws that were made then, and we can look at how like that kind of narrative about people has impacted us now, then what kind of change, 100 years from now, if we're changing our rhetoric now, what is the change that we'll see in the future? And that seems to really, that lands with people really well, to think about like, oh, if we, like, it's not the only answer to things, it's not going to solve all of our problems, but that seems to land super well for people to think about, like, oh, if we change the narrative about things, then the ways that we then approach other behaviors, the way that we talk to and about people, the way that we support survivors, as that narrative changes, so do our actions change. And so that's a way that, yeah, we totally have that concern come up a lot. And that's not, again, like Lindsay said, like, that's not proven, right? Like, we can't prove that that will happen, but that's such an easy way for folks to kind of like almost buy into this idea of the more education we have, the more awareness we have, the more practical tools we have, the more we'll see, this shift in our thinking about prevention and about survivors and violence overall.
I'm really glad that you brought up rhetoric, because honestly, I think one of the things that comes up most often when I'm talking to folks about prevention work is just discomfort in both what it means to have the conversation, and then also discomfort with what the dominant cultural conversation is typically about assault, and also really is about sex, right? Like, we as a culture, because of the legacy of white supremacy, are really uncomfortable talking about sex, and also really uncomfortable talking about pleasure and like what it means to have a body, and a body that a person might enjoy being in. And if we can't talk about those aspects, if we can't talk about the reasons, like we're working with younger folks, the reasons why kids might want to engage in sexual activity or sexual contact, then how can we talk about the reasons a person might not want to, right? And how a person might articulate that to themselves and to others. And I think that sort of just general discomfort in talking about sex, particularly with young folks, really leads to taking a sort of just say no or abstinence only type of a narrative, even around sexual violence, which is inherently kind of victim blaming, right? Because it puts the emphasis on the person who might be harmed, but also just neglects like the deep and complex web of reasons why people choose to and choose not to engage in sexual contact with one another. I come from a background in teaching sex ed, right? So I've talked about sex to so many people at so many different ages. And one of the things that has struck me so often is that whether I was working with 5th grade students or adults, often the questions they were asking were pretty much the same, right? Like questions around, how do I know that this is okay for me? How do I know that this is okay for other people? How do I know how to talk about that? And if we can't have those conversations with kids, how do we expect adults to know how to have those conversations, right, with themselves and with others?
Within all of those pieces, I think it ends up being so crucial, and just like you're talking about Martina there at the end, especially the modeling aspect and that piece of it, that even just the practice piece, so often, like a lot of the folks that, in working with, and oftentimes a question comes up is like, what is my community ready for, right? And we understand that growth and change takes time. And also like finding that balance that, again, it's like, well, we're not going to get any better at these conversations and these topics, and, in sitting in whatever discomfort, if we're not practicing, if we're not having them. And in the meantime, if we're, lack of a better words, if we're taking an approach that, I think sometimes either goes too slowly or like skirts around like the main issues that are root causes for so much violence, we have to also then acknowledge the communities and people in our communities who are experiencing the greatest amount of harm, who are not being served, right? Who are, it's like and especially like depending on our roles in our communities, our agencies, wherever we may be looking at our platform. It's really important, I think, that we can utilize that to be able to show up for communities and really get to model within these conversations we're practicing. And it's important for this because we need to make sure that everyone is getting access to care, health, and safety in their community and in their relationships, versus prioritizing people's comfort. And a lot of times, like white men's comfort in general. So I think those are, it all just echoes so many of the questions that, and concerns that end up coming up.
Thank you for all of that. Your responses are making even me think about not only the ways that we are uncomfortable talking about sex and pleasure, but the ways that we police sex and pleasure and police sexual behavior, and what is considered appropriate, what is considered acceptable, when people experience violence, who's treated differently, often based on race and gender and class. So there's so much unpacking in there. Martina, earlier you were mentioning how youth are suffering in particular right now. And I think that leads into the next question really nicely, is talking about how COVID has impacted the prevention work that you're doing and ties to the community, not just how that has impacted youth. I know that's part of the conversation, but would love to hear from each of you on that.
Well, I can jump in and just say that, like what hasn't COVID affected in all of our lives? I found myself just a moment ago going like, oh God, do I even remember what it was like to do this work? Like the last 3-ish years feel like they have taken up the entirety of my brain now. But I would say that, when I'm not going to try to bright side COVID because this has been a goddamn disaster, right? And also when I am trying to think about what's different now, I do think that one of the big differences that I see is that there is a significantly greater awareness of just how bad things can be and are, and a significantly greater desire amongst community partners to reach out and be in partnership. It's like the 3 whatever-ish years of being so isolated and so removed from resources, and then getting kind of like thrown back together without a lot of support or additional resources that everyone could have needed, has really meant people have just gone like, oh gosh, this isn't working. And that's a terrifying moment to be in, and also like profoundly a moment of possibility, right? To acknowledge that like the systems we're in don't work. Or more accurately, perhaps they work very well for the people they're supposed to and were built to work for, and not for the rest of us. And so then what does it mean collectively to try to create some different systems? And that is a huge task, right? Like that's the task of all of our lifetimes, is to continue to create better and more productive and more supportive systems. But just having big institutions like school districts acknowledge that like we need outside help. We're not the only people who can and should be working with kids, or to see, other forms, like other community spaces say like, oh, wow, this is a problem here. Who is an expert in the community? Who can we bring in? And I really appreciate getting those asks, right? Like it really makes me feel like we're working together.
Jumping on the possibility thread there. I mean, for us, it really was an opportunity to really think about how creative we can be with prevention and what the possibilities are. And I love the connection of an in-person training. I feel like that is like the best thing in almost the entire world. I love it so much, but we really had to start thinking about accessibility, right? We had to start thinking about like who's actually able to take time off from work and come sit in a building for 2 hours, who has transportation, who has childcare options. And so for us, when we started thinking about that, those kinds of things, and those aren't all the barriers, of course, by any means, there are so many, but it kind of gives an idea of what's holding people back from being able to participate in prevention, especially adults, from my end, adults. So when we decided to restart all of our like big trainings for folks, we started doing it 3 times a year on Zoom, and our participation like astronomically increased because of you can just be at home with your kids. You can listen while you're at work if you're able to do that. You don't have to drive somewhere. You don't have to find childcare. You don't have to figure out the timing with your work schedule. And so when we were able to like remove a lot of those barriers, it created this like much bigger opportunity to invite people into the conversation with us, who typically it would be a challenge for them. It would be like a burden on them to participate because of, we work like 8 to 5, or we're doing it in our building. And what if somebody's on the other side of the state and they want to participate, but they can't drive all that way? And I think it forced us to be creative. It forced us to think about those barriers. It forced us to really be more accessible in general. And I think that's a really good thing. Again, would I like to be in person for every single training? Absolutely. But I think it's really great how Zoom became more normalized for folks, and people have learned, even people who've like never touched it before, learned how to navigate. So I think that, obviously COVID, I don't want to minimize any of the impact, right? Like we don't want to minimize that, but at the same time, it really forced us out of our box and forced us to really think much broader about what does community look like, who's in our community, and how can we invite that community into what we're already doing.
You or me, Eli, they were. Yeah, I mean, I think another direction that Cecilia, I'm still kind of lingering on what you brought up initially, is how youth are really struggling, especially after COVID. And Martina, in another meeting, you mentioned something really beautiful that I've been lingering on too, talking about like that doom that can really manifest when we don't have the future that we need yet accessible to us, and how there's just a lot of kids really ruminating in that. And so I guess, I love that we've been talking about the positives, and I also think about like the hardships of COVID, especially on one of our primary populations in prevention, which is young folks, and how they are really struggling. And I don't know about you all, but it's really challenged me to start thinking, as we're kind of been talking about, of really the expansion of violence prevention. How can I go in and talk about a healthy relationship and not talk about mental health, or at least mention it, and these other things that really tie together completely or just even loosely, and so feeling a little bit stretched, I think, to make sure that we are meeting the needs that youth have right now, which they have quite a number. And also feeling like that has opened up possibilities, like you all have mentioned. And a big thing that has come out of COVID is seeing that extreme, in that crisis situation, that oppression just got so much more transparent, I think, for folks. And so, before the pandemic, I worked at Stark at the time, and with Cecilia, and talked about anti-oppression work, and people were kind of like, yeah, I think so. I get it, and the schools were like, I guess you can talk about that. And then, after the pandemic, it was like, no, okay, you need to have this. We need to have this all over the place, in every conversation. So it really opened up the doors too to in that way, expand what violence prevention means, because we're talking about it as a way of being anti-oppressive, and being these strategies that we're doing as anti-oppression work. Just expanded it quite a lot. So I'm still reflecting on all the needs that youth have, and our communities in general, basic needs just not being met structurally. But how can we, in the prevention community, really like expand the work that we're doing beyond just talking about violence to these other ways that are prevention, which I know Eli loves to talk about too.
Oh gosh, do I love talking about that? Oh my goodness, so much. And I again, just everything you all have mentioned is so on point, and really the bulk of what I would have to add. So I won't say too much more here. But yeah, I really like that highlight, especially around and getting to those additional streams, right? The streams of prevention. Because so often, like even if you take Oregon into like a map of like the big major rivers in Oregon, right? Like we have some main prevention strategies and some main prevention spaces. But in reality, right, like we're all going to live next to a different river. We're going to have something that comes by us that like connects with us. And so I think it's in terms of really recognizing all the overlapping shared, root causes and forms of violence. And I think too, for communities really expanding their definition of like what violence means and all the ways that we can be doing prevention, right? When we're addressing mental health, when we're addressing systemic racism, and that it's all so integrally linked together, that, not to put it on, someone that is like, you have to do all these things at once, but just again, it's like we're all playing a role in this. And just knowing that whenever these different pieces are happening, like there's those tributaries, there's those smaller rivers of water that are adding up. And so I think it's finding more ways to really collect and connect people to prevention and resources, and then also really specializing on what people need and getting to individualize it a little bit more.
Yeah, what I'm hearing and what you're saying is that nothing exists in a vacuum, and even COVID in and of itself was intersected with so much racialized violence, the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and Elijah McClain, just to name a few, environmental violence with fires and environmental disasters that have impacted, I think, youth and adults, and experiences of violence that feel very much personal and at home for many people, and for people with more privilege, really recognizing how commonplace that violence is. So I think your points about the need of anti-oppressive lenses in prevention work, that they can't be separated. That segues really nicely into, where do you all find overlap in your prevention work with similar fields, whether it's sexual assault or domestic violence or trafficking, and maybe particularly on this divide that seems to exist between violence response and violence prevention? I get the sense that there's probably a lot of advocates here, and maybe prevention isn't like an integrated part of many organizations. So yeah, if you could speak to the overlaps you see, and then also that divide and how you view that divide.
I'll jump in. So I think, one thing that I've really struggled with is, connecting the prevention work we do back to the amazing folks who are doing advocacy and that response side of our work, and then taking their feedback and looping that into what we do in prevention. And I don't know, I can't speak for everybody else, but I've always found it incredibly important that prevention folks do have like that background, or at least a little bit of experience working with clients and with folks who have experienced harm in that direct service way, because I think we need to speak from that lived experience, and hopefully like carry that lived experience in our teams and value that. So I think that is so like key for us to be able to do the work. And oftentimes I think response kind of gets lost in connecting back to prevention. And I know that I can speak for the child abuse world, right? Like I often struggle with like, what are kids experiencing right now? What are the harms that we've seen increase over time, or be the most prevalent in our community, and how is that showing up in families? And so trying to learn that from my response team, who are used to like handling the crisis in the moment and dealing with it, and then hopefully that person finds those next steps, right? How can you link back to me, and I can learn from that? And on the other side of that, I'm sure many of us also do prevention on this call. And so like the struggle of trying to really connect the advocates and the folks doing that direct response to the prevention work. And I guess my like thing with that is really like finding a way to get folks not to necessarily do the prevention work, but to have a prevention lens in their work at all times. I think that is like so much more valuable, because, and I've talked to this group about it, but like, yeah, my response folks are doing amazing prevention work, and they may not even be realizing it. Those conversations that they're having with folks who have been harmed are often like planting seeds of psychoeducational, like good content that can help them like go through life and develop those healthy relationships and those healthy communities. And they're connecting them with resources, which we know is like a big factor for violence prevention and all of this. So I think it's so important for them to see that their work is prevention oriented, and how can you continue to have like a prevention lens at viewing this person. And I think that comes down to like recognizing that even though you are meeting them in that crisis moment, that is like a snapshot of their experience, which I know you all know, but that we can in that snapshot kind of be that person to help them like and model what a healthy support system looks like, and really help them develop that going forward. So, but it's tough, I will say, to make that connection, because again, it's been so siloed historically. And again, I think it could really benefit from more of our different forms of violence backgrounds really coming together, because we have advocates that are doing all different types of violence or anti-violence work, and prevention folks doing all types of anti-violence work. And I'm sure we could really benefit from learning from one another further.
Can just jump in and add here to it. And it's on that topic, Lindsay, especially of the response piece and advocates, and then the ripple effects that potentially come later. And just like for me, a story that always like ties me back to about 6 or 7 years ago, I was doing prevention work in high schools down in the Grants Pass area. And I was running specifically like young men's classes. And I had the start of the school year, yeah, just done a couple sessions, but I had like a new like student show up into class. They kind of hung out and they were quiet in the back, but then, they came up and talked to me, at the end. They said, hey, years ago, I had, a family member who, had been through domestic violence, and they, talked to an advocate, and the advocate told them, this and this and this. I don't remember the exact pieces. And they said, that they told my family member that. And then, like my family member, and it's created conversations with myself and my siblings. And it is totally shaped like that. They said, like, that advocate's words, because it was the same advocate at the agency I was working at. They said, like, one of your advocate's words, like, shifted like what me and my siblings like see and want for our relationships going forward. Right. So that's just like the power of like that in the presence, and really that presence being so key, of course, which, like so many folks that are, doing advocacy, and then the presence for also folks with prevention. But, there can be so many little glimmers, and, what we remember from a day that may be like hardly anything, especially when trauma is going on. But sometimes those nuggets can really stick with people and totally pass on in so many ways. We never always know where that may lead to. But yeah, I think that those pieces end up being so important. And like we had mentioned the other day, like how prevention and response end up being two sides of the same coin, or two sides of the same pancake, if you want a pancake reference. And really, to do one, you need the other, right? And if it's one thing to talk about prevention, but then if I don't know the exact like what that looks like on the side of response work, like I'm not able to give someone a warm handoff, I'm not able to connect someone or potentially prepare someone if needed. And then vice versa, all the ways that, just the modeling through the response process, leads into that prevention messaging. And then really for us as preventionists, like shapes so much of the work that we do directly, returning into the community. And then, yeah, and especially with the pieces then of the overlapping, forms of violence too, right? If we're talking about, sexual assault prevention, domestic violence prevention, suicide prevention, child abuse prevention, you name it. Like there's so often so many, since they share so many of the same root causes, they also share so many of the same protective factors, right? And so there's some amazing suicide prevention curriculums out there, like Sources of Strength, that does a lot of community building. It can do some really cool stuff in conversations and really fostering environments of emotional safety and vulnerability and practicing, and it's like, I'm like, that's amazing healthy relationship education right there, right? And sometimes the school's like, oh, but what else do we need to do? I'm like, it's a great start, right? So, I think that there's so many of those shared protective factors that gives us a lot of opportunity for our prevention work to really go deep and branch out and again, have more of a chance of impacting folks.
Yeah, I mean, I think what y'all are getting at is that dividing line between prevention and response is really mushy. And honestly, I'm I've been the executive director for about a year, but I was an advocate and a program manager before then, and so I'm still kind of new to the administrative side of things. And the thing that has really just like radicalized me a lot over the last year, honestly, is just seeing the way that so many of our structures are really artificially determined by funding, right? I mean, how much of us would say that the response work we're doing is prevention work as well, if it weren't for the fact that a lot of us are funded in ways that mean that we cannot say we're doing prevention, right? And I think that that's across the age ranges as well. I think it's really easy to see that in working with school age kids. But I'm thinking about, back when I was teaching sex ed and I would go to inpatient drug and alcohol recovery centers for adults, which was one of my favorite populations to work with. So much fun. And, I would show up for like a couple days and I would talk about STDs and I would talk about birth control and I would talk about healthy relationships and consent. And there was almost always a moment in that like 3, 4, 5 day long sequence while I was there where people had like come to trust me a little bit and where someone would finally raise their hand and be like, well, you know what, honestly, I've never had sex sober. And then like, it would be like an I am Spartacus moment where then like hands would go up across the room as people would be like, yeah, me neither, yeah, me neither, yeah, me neither. And if I had just defined consensual sex as being sex that is not under the influence, right, then there would be this moment of like, well, what does that mean? And then we had to complicate those definitions a bunch. And then we often had to have the conversation of like, well, what does that mean for your future? Like, how, like, what are the things you want for yourself in your future? Like, if alcohol and drugs aren't part of your life, what does sex look like? And that was violence prevention work, right? And that was also drug and alcohol recovery work, and that was also sex ed work, and that was also response, because almost to a person, the folks in those programs would also identify or acknowledge that they had experienced sexual violence. And so it's so much both and that I'm genuinely in this moment in my career kind of struggling to see that dividing line as anything other than like a mesh sieve or some other metaphor. I mean, we had a pancake metaphor a minute ago, so I feel like I can use that one.
Yeah, I would totally agree with you, Martina, about the like red tape involved with prevention. I remember when I started, it was one of the grants that I was funded by. It was like super strict that you couldn't even like talk about suicide prevention at all. Like it was, you couldn't even like mention it. It was a huge thing in that grant. And I'm excited to see it changing like that, because we have this more holistic understanding of what violence can look like and how often these things overlap. That's another thing that really sticks with the adults that I talk to, is this idea of like, if there's one thing going on, there's a decently high possibility that there's something else going on. And so in order to actually support someone, we've got to come at it from every angle of the things that are happening, because just treating one symptom isn't going to solve everything. Like just treating one piece of what someone is experiencing, that's just one thing when all these other things are going on. And so I think about like our shelter and housing teams are amazing at like making that connection for folks about housing specifically, and their work around, even though they're doing like getting people into housing, like I think about their work as prevention, because it's like, right, it's so much like housing in itself is prevention, but even just like talking to different housing authorities, talking to the state and the county about the importance of housing. But I think that like as a field, we're still trying to catch up with internally making those connections to prevention. I think because that red tape for so long has been there, that we've kind of just like been a little scared to talk about it, even like among ourselves as prevention. And I think that's something that anyone who is working with an agency like ours or in an agency like ours, like I think that's a conversation we need to start having about it, because we're already doing it, but we don't want to like reinvent the wheel every time, right? So if we just make those identifications together, I think that that would really change not just the conversation with ourselves and our community partners, but I think that that will be a place where it starts to trickle into that funding and the way that grant funders and other folks are really thinking about what we're doing.
I wonder if y'all could share, do you have any examples or strategies? What I'm hearing from this last response in particular is the importance of relationship and community building, both within an agency, between agencies, and also with communities. Are there examples you have or strategies you've used about how to initiate those relationships and then how to build them and how that influences the work?
I have a couple of examples that come to mind because in our organization, I often tell people like our therapy department is probably doing stronger prevention in some ways than even the prevention work that I'm doing, because they are working with youth after they've been harmed and like kind of processing that healing. And they're able, I mean, we're lucky that we can also have the ability to do therapy with families and also youth that have caused harm, like problematic sexual behavior stuff. So they just need support. They need to know like what's healthy, what's not, and that is prevention, right? Being able to address that earlier on in life so that they don't do that as adults, right? So great work, and I think what one of my strategies has been talking about it that way. Essentially, when I'm talking about our services, talking about how our response folks are doing prevention, and highlighting that. I think that's really important that community members and my organization staff hear how they are already doing prevention. They don't have to feel like it's an extra burden in some ways, because I think that's always the fear internally with other staff is they're like, oh, you're going to make me go do that education stuff. And I really don't want to do that. I don't want to go on presentations. I don't want to go talk to kids. Like I love them. And, like, right. So it's, I get it. You're already so busy doing the crisis work that you're doing. So how can I already just like empower the fact that you're already doing prevention? And then I think like another strategy that's really helped me that I've really implemented recently is asking those folks, how can I support the work that you're doing and better it in the sense of like give you more resources and tools to talk about prevention, make it easier to bring those little seeds of prevention that Eli's story so greatly had. How can we bring those even further into the conversation when you're working with clients or with folks who have been harmed? And so we've done a project recently where I'm doing YouTube videos, which trust me, I have no passion for making videos. It's not like my passion project in any way. It's like I know that what is going to help is giving our case managers some extra tools so that they can give something to families, to kids after they've left, after that crisis moment, that they can like do a little bit of like education around certain questions they may have that are additional, right? And so I'm making these like 5-minute videos, and I'm also asking folks in our area, in my clinic to help me do that. But, I think promoting that, like, how can I help you bring prevention into your role? Even if it's not like the most fun thing for my prevention life to do videos, these one-time videos that are like 5 minutes long, it may make a huge difference to them when they're trying to do prevention work within response. So, yeah.
I think kind of similarly to what Lindsay was saying about, particularly the piece where you were saying, like, how can I help you? I think that a little bit of like cold calling and cold emailing with the community is a bit of what you kind of have to do. You kind of have to take the chance in like reaching out to people in our communities, especially when it comes to like, do we want to get businesses involved? Do we want to get like banks and restaurants? And do we want to get all these people involved? And instead of waiting like for them to realize that maybe they need your support and like learning more about what you're doing, just going ahead and starting to build those relationships with them. Are you facing anything right now that we can help with resources that we can come in and talk about with your folks? And I think that goes for, our various other organizations as well, coming in and saying, here's some things that we have, like, does any of this work? Does any of this work for you? Can we support your staff in any way? So that we're not adding additional work on you. I think just this idea of, I was reading Father Greg Boyle, who runs Homeboy Industries in California. They're really cool. If you want to look them up, they're awesome. But I was reading his book, Tattoos on the Heart, and he was talking about how like help for someone is that's not the most useful thing for us to be doing. It's kinship. It's this idea of like, I'm not just like leading you or even just walking beside you. I'm like with you. I'm with you and in you and doing it with you. And so I think this idea of like, what can we, thinking about things in terms of numbers or data isn't as helpful as just saying like, I'm here to support what you're already doing. How can I show up for you? How can my agency show up for you? And I think that's such a huge part of that relationship building, on top of, all the other things that we're doing. So it's a little more work on us, but I think that really makes a difference when we're coming in with like, not just what can you do for me? Like, what can I get from you? But instead, I'm seeing this in my community. I may be seeing this kind of thing pop up in my agency. So how can I like support you in doing those things as well?
I wonder if this is a good time before we come back and talk about what mutual aid could look like within communities, which is kind of a natural, I think, follow-up to this conversation. If it's 10:55 now by my clock, if we take a 5-minute break, encourage folks to use the restroom, get up or stretch, get something to eat or drink, whatever feels good for you, and we will start our conversation again at 11. Sound good? Cool. I'm seeing some heads nodding. All right, we'll see you at 11. All right. I think, yep, all of our panelists are back. We're gonna jump back in it with questions. And just a reminder, if you and the listeners want to throw a question in the chat or raise your hand, we're happy to not just go off of the list that you'll also find in the chat. We were all just talking about the role of community engagement and relationship building, and Lex, that reference to kinship and the role of building kinship and not just providing services, I think speaks to the potential for what mutual aid can look like in prevention work. And I'm wondering if you can describe what the role of mutual aid might be in prevention work, particularly outside of the nonprofit space, which multiple of you have talked about. There's inherent limitations to doing prevention work within a nonprofit space. So yeah, I'm curious what you think mutual aid can look like in communities. What are examples that maybe you've seen or would like to see?
Yeah, definitely. So I started in youth violence prevention and love it. I love youth violence prevention a lot. And I saw how much kids were like going home and not getting the same messaging that we were providing. And they weren't getting the same like kind of support in a lot of cases. And so it really started me thinking about this idea of like holistic wraparound support for students and for just like people in our community in general. But it started for me with youth, which is why I kind of made the swap to adult education. And I think that for people outside of the nonprofit sphere, outside of the social service sphere in general, I think that mutual aid in one way, there's, a million different ways that this can look like, but I think one way is to learn more and to actually know about these topics, to be able to talk to your kids about these things, to be able to talk to your friends and your neighbors. Because if we're the only ones who are talking about this, if we're the only ones who are providing any kind of information for folks, then I don't think things are really going to change. If you don't know what abuse looks like, you can't address it, right? If you don't know that you are being abused by someone, you don't know to reach out. If you don't know who to reach out to, you're probably not going to reach out to somebody. And so I think that one aspect of that mutual aid is folks taking the responsibility for each other and really, again, like diving into that kinship idea of, yes, they're my neighbor, they live in a different building than I live in, but we're still responsible for each other. We're still responsible for our community as a whole, whether we have a strong relationship with every single person or not. And so I'm very, like I said at the very beginning, I'm super encouraged by our community wanting to get more involved. And I think that we need to be thinking about how we, as the like quote unquote professionals in this world, are talking about what that looks like. Because I think that it can seem really scary to people to like, oh, now I have to learn about all these like really awful, terrible things. Like I have to learn about these things. And I think that we need to start approaching it in a way that is more inviting and that feels digestible and like people actually have a place coming to what we're talking about, instead of, I can't tell you how many times I've gotten an email or a phone call that's like, I don't work in this. I'm not like a therapist or a doctor or anything. Is this for me? Like, is it okay if I come to this workshop or this event? And I'm like, absolutely. And so I think that it's not only, what can we encourage people to do in mutual aid, but it's our responsibility as the people in it to find ways to talk about this that is not intimidating to people and that actually gives them the skills to be able to then go out and do those things. Not just information, but now that you have all this information, what do you do with it? What are like some simple ways that you can address a problematic joke in your workplace, that you can respond to a survivor who discloses to you in a healthy way? How do you make a referral to one of our agencies? How do you make that phone call with someone? What are you going to expect when you make that phone call? So I think that it's a lot about knowing and having the practical impact. But then again, it's also on us to really help people feel welcome in our spaces to be able to learn that aspect of mutual aid.
I so agree. And I really I love the concept of kinship that you brought up. And I think one of the things that is most profound for me about how powerful mutual aid is, and also that really demonstrates to me the limitations of nonprofit as a model, which is not to say that it's not a good model, but that it has inherent limitations, is that violence shows up in different ways for different people, right? And I think it's safe to say that all humans are affected by violence, right? This gets back again to how mushy the difference between prevention and response is, right? Especially if we're considering things like ancestral trauma, right? All of us are living in an ambient miasma of traumatic experiences, right? That's modernity. But different forms of violence might be more salient in different moments for different communities. And so I think one of the things that can be most powerful as a nonprofit who is doing this limited work in this limited frame, right, with this limited scope, is to show up in the spaces that we're invited into and to ask what what is actually showing up for you in your community? What forms of violence are you most concerned about? What are the things that rise to the top of your list? And often those are not going to necessarily look the exact same in every community, right? When I was way back when in college, when I was starting to do this kind of work as an undergrad, I was in East LA and I went to a Quaker college. So Quakers have this, huge value for doing community-based work. And so we showed up and, I think we showed up with a lot of good intentions and also into inherently the narratives around what we were doing. I came in with my little lens of, healthy sexuality and sex ed. And, that was what I was there to do. And the communities that we were connecting with, their biggest concern was environmental justice and the inherent state-sponsored violence that is environmental injustice and environmental racism. And they were yeah, that's a really good thing. You're talking about how we should all have condoms available in our schools, but also we live by the interchange of the 405 and 605 freeway. So breathing the air is smoking a pack a day. You want to talk about that for a minute? And it was a really great education. And oh yeah, that maybe is of higher concern to you in this moment, but also that doing the work that it takes to solve those problems, because the root causes of violence are so linked, is doing the same work. And so finding ways that we can show up to support the work that communities are already doing, not by saying oh, and also you should focus on this thing we're doing, but by saying you are already doing the work that we're doing. Here's the thing that we have access to. Would this be of use to you? You're already doing the thing that you're doing, but I have access to grant writing. And I have a 501c3 stamp on my bills. And so that means that I can apply for this funding. Would you like some of it? How can we make that available to you? How can we bring you in? How can we incentivize your participation? Making use of the tools that we have to meet folks where they're at is not just about getting them in the door, right? It's about opening all of the doors for all of us to be present together.
Really like that about opening all the doors for us to be present together. That visual image is really great, and I think really does get to the crux of it all too. I think sometimes, to be honest, one of the favorite things that brings me joy about getting to do some of the work I do is when I get to uplift some other cool work from another space, another organization, or pass out this is a rad organization and they are doing this, here's signups, or here's their podcast, check it out. The spreading of knowledge and just that cooperation that comes through, and that conduit, right? And that exchange just leads to so many different spaces. And so I think that, yeah, as many times as we get to just really, show up, and even just, again, the modeling of learning about all those other efforts and really the movements, right? We have our individual efforts and things we're working on, but especially what I love about, bringing in environmental justice and how much violence has been done to communities. And right, yeah, in terms of getting all these other pieces, it is so hard to focus on just in general, the day to day, when we know that our cancer rates are through the roof and all these other pieces that are just making it hard to even be in the moment and be present. So the more that we get to connect those pieces and, to connect our efforts to the additional movements that are around us, and that web just like really branches out in so many ways. And then I think too, something that especially when we're like with community and again, boosting the roles and recognition of like, holy crap, like the work you're doing is amazing. Just, whether it's prevention, whether it's response, and how it all ties together, but also when we're working with folks and talking about, like it was brought up earlier, like sometimes for people coming into conversations around violence prevention, it's been so stigmatized in so many ways, and people have that image. To be honest, for me, I go back to DARE programs in school, like back in the day, and like the 90s of like, this is DARE, and this is like, and then yeah, right, it's like, okay, and people think like, okay, this is what that must look like. It's the assembly, it's the curriculum, it's this, but really also like encouraging folks, especially in a way that doesn't overwhelm. It's like, what are the ways that you could, engage in some of these conversations in a passion lane of yours, right? Like, where's something that fills you up? Like, do you love to garden? Ooh, is there any cool community gardening or events happening, or does your community need one? There's a way you can support it, or, like there's so many ways that can like build into that. I've, had a friend who has called me up out of the blue, out of nowhere. And he said, hey, I just listened to this Marshawn Lynch podcast, who's an ex-NFL football player. And Marshawn was talking about the importance of relationships and connecting with people. And like, and so I just wanted to reach out and say hi and how are you, right? Like all those ways where within someone can get into a passion or a space. And especially I think, sports can also like be a spot where what was amazing during going back to COVID times and the pandemic, the freaking sports shut down, right? And all the extra attention that came into what's happening in the world, but also recognizing like the vehicle of sport can drive storyline, can drive people's interest, and those are human beings, athletes that also have real lives. And a lot of times it's amazing how people connect on that, and I'll like talk with friends about something. They're like, okay, great, but then they'll tell me the same thing because they learned about it through an athlete, or maybe it's through a media personality or a movie star. It's like, so I think getting to support people like, yeah, intake media, intake the things that also bring you some fulfillment and some de-stressing. And then maybe there's some ways that, that overlaps too in our efforts.
In hearing you talk about kind of like the collective trauma that we all live in, and then also recognizing that that trauma shows up very differently in different communities, I'm thinking in our local context, particularly about Black communities in Oregon, about immigrant communities in Oregon, those who are undocumented. What are the culturally specific, cross-cultural, cultural humility considerations that come up in prevention work? Again, thinking in that nonprofit is a predominantly white space. We on this panel are predominantly white folks, and Oregon has a really prolific lineage of incredibly racist legislation and culture in society. For prevention work, whether it's mutual aid or within our agencies, what does that look like to center those communities and support work that's being done by those communities and at culturally specific organizations?
I think it's just ties so much to what everybody just said, which is the big takeaway that we have to accept that we cannot be the givers of prevention in all spaces. We cannot be the messenger in all spaces. And in fact, we are better off passing off what those prevention messages and that information that we hold or are given because of our privilege and being in this work and getting paid to do this work, and passing that on to communities in our world. And I know that that's like huge for me working at CARES Northwest. I know the work that we do is very important, and also I'm not shy about the fact that we are incredibly tied to these institutions and these structures that have hurt people, especially Black folks, especially people of color, and really disrupted families in so many ways. And so I'm not going to be the best person to come to those communities, and I'm not going to even try and push that for myself because I don't want to create a relationship that's going to cause harm. don't want to go in and not have the support that they need, right? Even if I'm a trusted resource or I can be a support for folks, maybe I can't rely on the whole system that is behind me to be that same resource for folks, right? Yeah, if I'm meeting with people and they're like, hey, this is going on at home, I can't even say like, hey, call CARES Northwest and they'll be able to help you, right? Because I think there's so many issues with reporting and then also with DHS, like there's just all of that complication for folks. So I just think that's like a very real thing to be able to pass it along to those communities and be the one to pass on the knowledge that we have. And I know that, I mean, we've done that with a couple organizations already, and it feels sad, I think, to not be in connection with community members as much as I'd like to. But I think it's in some ways like a better thing and more safe thing to do for communities is to pass to the staff of the organizations that are creating community. So I think of like Adelante Mujeres as being a great example of that, and they're looking to like start up parent cafes. I think that's a great like prevention technique of strategy, and they have this amazing community that they've built that trusts them, and that's fantastic. And it doesn't have to be somebody with all of the prevention knowledge coming in and teaching that, but somebody from their community, right? And we recently worked with the Center for African and Immigrant like Refugees organization in Portland, and they're really fantastic. And it was about talking to their staff about how we can create a culture in the organization around healthy relationships, consent, all this positive stuff, and knowing that like they're going to be the best models for setting that. So from my perspective, that is like the best thing we can do is like we can't be knowledgeable about what every culture needs and whatever every group needs because it's always going to be different. So it's letting that community lead that.
I don't know that I can add much to that, Lindsay. I think that kind of got all the points. The one thing I would add that I think we can all do just to kind of examine ourselves is I heard someone talking about how they like took a look at their bookshelf and how many books do you have that are written by white men or white people. And I think that really intentionally considering the sources that we're getting our prevention information from is really crucial, because this field has been in the like, again, in the quote unquote professional world, this has been primarily white for a really long time. And so a lot of what we're getting statistics wise, prevention ideas about how to talk about things, most of it is coming from white people. And so I think that's something that we can all do is just take a look at where we're getting things from and consider finding other ways to talk about that information that's not coming directly from white people.
Yeah, and along with that, I think that importance too of, and I love what you said there, Lex, around like, the historically like the professionalization of like prevention and how that's like just encoded for whiteness. And then think about all the amazing programs and community work that is prevention that is so key and so critical. And like Lindsay earlier, you mentioned like, this space may be doing more prevention like than what our program could even offer or do like in that moment. I think about all those really amazing programs that have been pushed out or pushed aside, kind of also in the guise of like capitalism. It's like, aha, we do this service, we offer this, and then right, let's expand. Like, okay, we'll do this here, we'll do that there, and so on. I think sometimes I don't know how many folks on this call are like within that admin position, right? And I know that it is hard within the nonprofit of being put in the space of like, okay, how are we funding our programs? How are we doing this? And it's as much as we can do that work in that practice, especially as shifting our mindsets of like, all right, there's never going to be this permanent expansive growth mode. Like at some point we have got to reframe what sustainability looks like for our organization. And so to make sure that we are not pushing out or delegitimizing other efforts that are so key and so critical, and then really getting to name and boost that. And sometimes and I also know that power differential that can be like if you're not in that admin position. I think I've had our conversations before, of telling my admin, depending on my role and what our organization can offer, I was like, we're not going to apply for this. We are not going to be the ones that take the lead on this. We will stand here and, and not stand here, but, we're listening if someone's reaching out to us and we want to support in any way and like in whatever form feels helpful for them. And also it's like, where this is not something to win, right? This is not something, and that is so critical. And again, I want to recognize that power difference, and that conversation doesn't always feel safe, depending on what our roles or our job is. But when we do recognize that, something is not, right in that way, and will potentially be harmful again to our overall goal of prevention and communities getting prevention that is effective, that connects in the way that, does it the best, right? Because it's so painful when you can see programs that have been, we just took everything we've done in this white-centered English space, and now it's in Spanish, and it's in like this kind of, this voice that doesn't match up, that doesn't line up, and people in the audience are like, this isn't connecting with me, and that pushes against and takes us farther away from where we need to get to. So when we can really hold in those moments and try and like help our organization if they are going in a different way, recognize this is something we need to be really thoughtful about and not just rush into and take over.
Lex, thinking about your comment about who's on our bookshelves and who we get information from, I just want to name some excellent resources and names if you're not familiar with them. Folks like Miriam Kaba, Mia Mingus, Adrienne Marie Brown are great names to Google, and I encourage folks in who are participating today, if there are thinkers who are people of color, people from different backgrounds, people who don't center a white lens that you want to share in the chat, this is an excellent opportunity for us to learn from each other and share those kinds of opportunities. I'm going to jump around the questions a little bit just because of the flow of the conversation, but somebody brought up briefly, the role of reporting and our organizations and the institutions we work for. Can you talk a little bit about the role of mandated reporting in prevention, the challenges and opportunities it brings up, and how you navigate those?
Well, I can jump in to start because this has consumed my waking life for the last several months, and I've ranted to everybody I know who is on this call about this too much over the last 6 months. So at SASS, we all of our advocates have advocacy privilege, so we are not mandated reporters even for minors. And I feel so lucky that in Oregon the law is so clear and so explicit that that right is extended to young folks. Right, that young folks have the right to access services confidentially, and that is a value. And I'm so proud of that. And having worked with youth for most of my career, I know so many of them who have said explicitly to me, I can't tell you what's going on in my life because you'll tell someone, and that's not safe for me, or that doesn't feel right to me. And so finally being in a place where that's not at issue is like such a gift. But that's also really hard within institutions that, for so many very understandable and reasonable reasons, don't have space for that or don't comfortably make space for that. Over the last year, SASS has developed a program within one of our local school districts providing advocacy within our high school spaces. Right now, we're responding, providing advocacy in the moment when high school students are going through the Title IX reporting process, and moving towards building up capacity towards having privileged advocates on site in our high schools. This is something the school district is behind. The superintendent and I came up with this program together. We're really excited about it, and people vacillate really strongly between being incredibly excited and incredibly nervous. And some folks, fundamentally don't believe that young folks should have that, confidential space, and that, that is an understandable thing. I don't agree, but it's understandable. And some folks do, but then they hit that but what point? And the thing that's come up most often for us is, well, yeah, obviously, it's really good for young folks to have this privileged space, this confidential space, except what about if they're suicidal? Or except what about if the person harming them is a teacher at the school? And it is really hard in those moments to acknowledge that, like, even then, we cannot break their confidence. And I think that this kind of like pushes on the inherent like paternalistic structure that our systems have, right? Which is to say that, like, well, the best way we can help them is to do something that they don't want us to do. The best way that we can help them is to take their power away, because really we all need to know, and then I can be in control and I can make those choices. And I don't think that people come to that space with bad intention or ill will. I think we probably all have the same core value, but it is really hard to let go of some of that control. And so I think when we're talking about, the challenges that mandatory reporting pose for me, like I think one of the biggest challenges that I encounter in just talking to people about why it's so important to have advocacy privilege for young folks is just really trying to make space for the fact that, like, there are going to be inherent risks to everything we do, right? Like, living in the world is risky. No one gets out of this thing alive, right? And we have to be willing to sit a little bit in that. And that is such a profoundly uncomfortable place. And I've had so many conversations over the last several months with people who are like, but I don't want this. This makes me uncomfortable. And one of the things that has really broken the ice most is when I have said, like, yeah, we should all be uncomfortable about the notion that young folks experience sexual violence. That should make us profoundly uncomfortable. We should feel disgusted by that. I do. So let's get from that place of discomfort to the what next, instead of staying in that place of discomfort and choosing to reduce our discomfort with the truth of the thing instead of reducing the risk for that kid, right? So often I think we're just so uncomfortable that we're like, well, I will feel less uncomfortable if I take power in that moment. But that's replicating the harm that that young person has experienced, right? And I'm still going to feel really uncomfortable if I'm giving the power all the way back to that kid. Like, I'm really scared in that moment. And also, that is the best thing I can do as the person in the position of power, right? Is to not replicate that harm. And that is tough, right? I really have so much sympathy for how hard this is for everyone. But ideologically, I think we need to find ways to talk around or talk about the discomfort that we feel, and around some of the ways that we can encounter and approach that discomfort in more holistic and more supportive fashions.
Yeah. Wow. If I could like just double, triple like everything you just said, Martina, it was so great, so perfectly executed, just said so well. And I think the reason I really feel the need to speak on this is because coming from the child abuse field, right? We've held on to that mandatory reporting very tightly. And half my career I've been a mandatory reporter, half of it I've been a confidential advocate. And so I've seen kind of both sides of that. I've worked with youth on both sides of that. And I think, I appreciate from the child abuse perspective that, especially when it comes to like child sexual abuse and little kids, what we see is that harm will not stop unless somebody is told, unless some intervention happens, right? And at the same time, I'm sure we all would know this, with prevention, it completely counteracts that mandatory report, and that taking away of control, as you explained, Martina, is completely in contradiction to the prevention work that we're doing, often talking about bodily autonomy and empowerment of youth, right? So how can I, continue to do this prevention work where we're telling youth, like, no one can do anything to your body without your consent and all of these things, and you are in control of that, and also then they're still pulled kind of in this process, pulled along in this process. And so, and I worked with a lot of teachers that some have seen mandatory reporting work out well for youth, and many have not. And, sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, right? And so, I don't know, we often talk about it as being two separate things, this mandatory reporting and confidentiality, and that they do not need to be adversarial, but especially for teens, they can work together. And I know I say that very optimistically, and I will also say that needs to come at the humility of mandatory reporters. Mandatory reporters need to understand that even when you make that report, that does not mean that the situation is going to be fully taken care of and fixed. We need to understand and recognize the value of confidentiality, because I think so many mandatory reporters do not get it, as you've explained, Martina, in a very like diplomatic way, might I add, because I think there needs to be some humility. Like, mandatory reporting in general is not working for adults. Why are we expecting that it should work for children, and that they should also go through this harmful system? That's really tough. So I know I'm coming from like the child perspective, but it's true for adults too, right? Where they're struggling with that. And so, and definitely teens fall in that category. And so I think, especially with those teenagers, being able to recognize that, yes, there can be these people who they can report to and something will be done or an action will be taken, and teaching mandatory reporters how to support beyond the report, how to be a continued trusted adult, because they told you for a reason. They came to you for some kind of relationship that you've already built. How can you continue that relationship? Especially, I've had a lot of teachers say making that report ruined my relationship with that youth, right? How can we better that process? And how can we bring in confidential advocates for teenagers and recognize that they are not a hindrance to the process, but rather an addition? As a confidential advocate for a period of time, I felt like what often happened was I provided that space where a teen could really share all that they're dealing with and be just completely honest, and we could build those strengths that they already have and build that like bravery to pursue that system if that's something that they want, right? And the last thing I think both systems want is for a youth to be pulled through a reporting process that they don't even want to be engaged in. And so I think my takeaway, or like my tip for all of you doing confidential advocacy in particular, is assert that you do deserve to be in those spaces, especially with teens, and that it can be together with mandatory reporters, and also assert that it can be a positive and promotion factor for teens. It's not a hindrance to them reporting or anything like that. And that ultimately it's up to youth to choose. They have the right to just say, I don't know, to every question that is asked of them in a report. They have the right to just be like, I don't want to be a part of this. And then that's how it goes. And don't be afraid to be the one to have to speak up for youth rights, because I think that's what we need to talk about in prevention, is like youth rights, bodily autonomy. It's all tied together. And if we want to stick to the word of our education that we provide, we need to do that in response to. Yeah, sorry, soapbox there, but.
Oh, the soapbox, I was like, no, all the soapboxes are on my wall. I'm just like, oh, these are the best soapboxes ever. But like, and I think, and because especially when we're having this conversation, and I think, again, it comes back to so important, but, and potentially even within this call is who is not here right now is, youth, right? Like, or like, in terms of, voices. And I think for someone, for myself also doing, spending time, also part of the domestic violence agency and then part of the child advocacy center, doing prevention in each space and, having different roles there. Like one thing that we can connect back to is what we have if we're just doing one thing working. And we know from so many sources it's not. We know that there's so many youth who are not being heard. I'm down here in Lane County, and the University of Oregon has a Center for Prevention of Abuse and Neglect. And they did an Oregon child abuse prevalence study a couple of years back, an initial trial here in Lane County schools. And I think one of the stats that sticks out to me is in the anonymous surveys that they sent out to youth here in school, up to students who had reported, experiencing violence. It was a large number, but also of those students who reported experience forms of abuse or violence, half of them said they had never told anyone, right? And so one thing we need to, and it's just been mentioned in so many of these conversations, is if we continue as is, we are not actually meeting survivors and letting the system be led by survivors and their voice. And because again, we're not having options, we're not having what works best, and rarely does a one size fit all work. And again, there's folks that are at the top of DHS and child welfare and the hotline that are having conversations about like, how do we shift this, right? Because they're recognizing overwhelmed, it's not working, and they're missing youth, and it's not doing what they want, especially when families are not getting connected to resources or supports that could totally change and shift the situation. And then, finally with that, I think when we can really put that platform, like has been mentioned, within our movement, especially I think within child abuse prevention, so often when we're working against ageism, we talk with communities about how it's so important to believe youth, to trust youth and their experiences and their power. And it can be just an exact opposite message. It doesn't line up with our words when we are consistently not modeling that in our approach to it and taking those spaces away. So yeah, I think it's a key conversation we'll continue on with.
I could talk about mandatory reporting literally all day. But one thing that I just wanted to bring up here at the end of this part of the conversation is I think there's a huge misconception, along with everything else that's been talked about. I think there's a huge misconception that confidential advocates advise against talking to a mandatory reporter. Like we're like demonizing mandatory reporters and like they're gonna hurt you and whatever. And that's just so not true, right? Like any of us who've been a confidential advocate or are one now, like that's not true. And what's helped me with explaining that to folks, especially to teachers and parents, is this image of a wall of doors. Like if you just think of like a huge wall of doors in front of you, and when mandatory reporting happens without, the kiddo or whoever, right? Because mandatory reporting is not just for youth, but when they, walk through that door, they have kind of like no idea most of the time what's on the other side. People don't know a lot about like Title IX. They don't know what that process is going to look like. They don't know what a call to CPS is going to look like. They don't know what a call to APS is going to look like. They have no clue. And so it's like opening a door and falling in a pit because you just have no idea what's going to happen next. But what we do as advocates and people, it seems to really land with people, is we just tell people like, here's this door. And if you want to walk through that, cool, I will walk with you through it. And here's what might happen next. Here's kind of the general process of what a Title IX process looks like. Here's kind of what it looks like to go talk to DHS for the first time. Here's what it looks like for a CPS worker to come to your home and check on you. Here's what going and getting a SANE kit done looks like, so that people are fully prepared and fully informed to be able to then consensually walk through that door and make that choice for themselves. And oftentimes that's going to be a mandatory reporter. Like that's often going to be that. We see all kinds of studies out there. I'll find the specific one I'm thinking of about co-located confidential advocates at college campuses, and how reporting actually like astronomically increases when there's a confidential advocate there. And I really just believe that it's because people have more information. And so I think that's a great way to talk to people about our confidential advocacy and kind of calm some of those fears, specifically around like whether or not we're like shielding people from mandatory reporters. But the other piece that I think I just want to emphasize that we've kind of been talking about this whole time is talking to people about how the systems that we want to work, that we want to be good for someone, we want going to law enforcement to be great for everyone, we want going to DHS to be like a wonderful experience for everyone and they get the things that they need there. But we have to be realistic that that's simply not true. For some people, it is a great experience and they get the court case and they get the whatever conviction and they get the, restorative justice that they want through some other system. But for a lot of people, those systems don't work in their favor. And by not allowing someone to make the choice to know their own history, their own context, their own risks, we are potentially putting someone in an intensely less safe environment by forcing them through a door. So think those are just all things to think about with mandatory reporting and confidential advocacy. And I think when you really are able to kind of get down to that kind of like brass tacks kind of conversation with folks, I think they do get it. I think they really do understand once you're able to have that deep conversation with people. But that goes back to when we were talking about relationships. I think we have to build those relationships with people. And this can be part of that relationship building, is having that conversation, validating, I believe you want to help kids. I believe you want to help people who are part of this mandatory reporting atmosphere that you're responsible for. And there's all these other factors that you have to take into consideration. I love mandatory reporters that we work with. They're wonderful people. They want to help kids. They want to help people, but they just don't always, they're not always encouraged within that system to think about how the systems impact people and what it can look like for a consensual report to a mandatory reporter.
I wonder if, before moving on to another question, someone could briefly share for the mandatory reporters on this call some other practices beyond knowing who confidential resources are in the area that can mitigate, if they're in a position where, and so much of mandatory reporting, sometimes people feel their jobs are on the line, liability is an issue. What are some practices that can mitigate harm for folks in those situations, especially around transparency? And yeah, if anybody has some brief thoughts on that.
I'm one of the mandatory reporters. I don't know if I'm the only one on the panel or not. Yeah, you are, Eli. Okay. So I mean, I think again back to like being there through the process and not seeing your role as singularly defined as making that report. I think this is pretty intuitive to us in this field and to advocates probably, but isn't intuitive to all mandatory reporters that you got to be there to just support that person when they make that disclosure. And truthfully, we're seeing that. We see teachers who say, oh, wait, hold on. I need to like make a report on this, and it just completely ruins the relationship, the way that report goes forward. Right, for that teen or for that youth. And so I think really talking to people about how to be trauma informed in your practice of handling a disclosure, which for us comes probably second nature, but needs to be taught to these folks. And again, building in ways that those folks can support someone after. I think many people have a lot of questions around like, can I talk to the youth's parents about this? Or maybe if, Lex, you brought up like, we got elderly folks who also would be affected by mandatory reporting and disabled folks. So like, can I talk to their support people and their caregivers? Like, hey, this report is being made. Here's what this means, but here's how I can support outside of this report. People have so many questions about that. And I think it's really worth exploring a little bit further. I think with youth, it can get really challenging if the people that are their support are people and other people are their support people are the ones harming them, right? And so you have to be really careful with that. But I think we need to start giving folks tools to be like mandatory supporters, which I know I've heard folks talk about nationally in different organizations. And I think Martina, you had mentioned like a great resource that had been talking about that. And I think that's just so important to see your role as going along with the process now that the report has been made, not just as the initial reporter. And I know that can be really hard in these systems that are often very closed doors. But I think just continuing that support regardless of how things turn out. Yeah, that's I would say probably one of my bigger takeaways for how you can kind of reduce that harm a little bit. And I will say, like, for youth, reach out to your children's advocacy center, because as much as we are tied to these reporting institutions like law enforcement and DHS, we aren't them. We are separate. We are folks who are trying to make sure that report is handled in a trauma-informed way. And I was actually recently talking with a coworker who said that they are seeing more teens who are experiencing peer-to-peer violence coming through our children's advocacy center. which is not as common. It used to be really mostly handled by DVSV organizations. And so how can we make sure that like both people are at the table? Because yeah, it would be much better than an officer coming to the emergency room, a patrol officer coming to the emergency room to gather your report. It'd be much better to come to CARES and like have that done by somebody who is trauma informed and has that skill of talking to you about that. And then you have to make it just one time, not like over and over again, you know? But we're not like partnering. Again, the separation in those systems is so clear. So I think connecting with that too could be a useful tool.
Thank you, Lindsay. And I also think these are great conversations for folks to bring back to your agencies. You know, if you are at an agency where most of you are mandated reporters and you haven't had group collective conversations about what transparency and being trauma informed can look like in that process, that's a fantastic opportunity for a staff meeting or a separate meeting. I wonder if we could pivot for a moment, because we focused, rightly so, a lot on prevention in youth. If we could talk a little bit about what prevention education looks like for adults and how folks are accessing that, why it's important.
I think am I the only one on the panel doing prevention for adults? No, okay. Well, it's my whole job, so I'll talk about it first. Yeah, I think I'm very, very excited about prevention for adults. It's something that is so new to the field in a lot of ways, especially with the focus on it, and it not being adults learning prevention so that they can then prevent things happening to their kids. Focusing a lot more on like your family, your friends, yourself, your grocery store clerk, like thinking about more than just how do we stop this in youth, which is obviously like a super important conversation. Right now on our end, it looks a lot like those education settings, lots and lots of learning opportunities, lots of practice opportunities, lots of really practical skills for folks to walk away with. We do things like how do you talk through like a really simple safety plan? How do you talk through like, okay, someone disclosed to you, what do you do now? What do you say? What are really healthy things to say? How do you go as a support person with someone to an agency or to the hospital or to law enforcement? How do you do that kind of work? As well as just general, I know we sometimes talk about like awareness being like we need to do awareness and action, right? Like we need to have both of those things. And what we found is that really people just like don't know what abuse necessarily looks like. When we hear domestic violence, people are thinking of like physical violence, right? Most of the time. Or if they're thinking about sexual violence, they're thinking about like the more quote unquote severe forms, right? But we're not talking about things like emotional or financial abuse that happens, how that is still domestic violence. We're not talking about how the sexualization of kids or the sexualization of women and femme folks and everyone, how all of that is still sexual violence, and that's still things that we need to be addressing, that then props up all of these other pieces that we do think about most of the time. So I think adult prevention is still in its very infancy. It's still very much in its baby stages, in the sense of we're still kind of figuring out what that looks like and who all needs to be involved. I think it's spreading a lot more to include how do we like encourage bartenders to do prevention work? How do we encourage the receptionist at whatever other business you're going to work in prevention work? What are like the everyday things that people are doing? How are we doing prevention there instead of just when someone comes to us or just when they disclose something? So it's a big wide world that we're still building, and taking so many points from youth violence prevention and how they do things, and just trying to figure out, this is just a different context. People have different needs. They adults want more, they want more studies, they want more statistics, they want, you know, kind of a different level of information as well. So it's shifting, but I'm excited about where it's going.
Did anyone else want to speak on work with adults?
Just very briefly, yeah. Oh, Lex, everything. That was so great. And then really just especially that thinking, it's something that we've been connecting a lot, and just with so many people, again, like some of our smallest actions, right, end up, you know, that's where we can start. Like you just, you know, mentioned, there's so many of those pieces. It doesn't have to be everything all at once and all these different you know, components. I mean, literally, you know, for some parents and, you know, adults who we've worked with, it's like some of the best, you know, yourself adult education you can do is when you are reading your book, you know, with your kids, or you're watching. Like, I grew up as a PBS kids, no cable or anything, and so like I'm forever an OPB kid, but like there's some amazing shows that are like connecting back to, and so it's like, watch, you know, are you watching those alongside, are you doing those? And then even bring that conversation back to other adults that we are, you know, hey, I watched this show, and they're like, there's so many ways that, you know, even this, like, this is a conversation that's happening that I think that as adults, that there's things that we missed out on, like learning, and it's like so many ways that we can connect back to through even just, you know, resources that are created for youth nowadays. And I think in many ways it's a great starting point for a lot of adults, honestly, to like to build in the skills and the practice and some of those base pieces. So yeah, again, that it can start in small segments and then really grow.
Do you all have any suggestions for maybe as folks are starting to have more conversations about prevention work in their communities or in their workspaces, they might be facing apprehension or they might not feel super confident about how to talk about it? What are some tips that you would give folks on, yeah, forms of introducing that conversation, or ways of describing the importance of prevention work and its intersectionality?
A really great question. I like, this is a little outside of that, but I think it's a good starting point for people, and I think it's a more comfortable starting point. I like Rianne Eisler a lot. With, it used to be called the Center for Partnership Studies. I don't remember what it's called now, but if you search that, you'll find it. And she talks a lot about how we want to move from a like domination mindset and a domination culture to a partnership culture. And I really think that that's a good entry point for people who are concerned or like feeling apprehensive about prevention, is just thinking about it as this kind of worldwide thing, and thinking about it as like, oh, we want to move away from this like very people over other people, and more to how do we think about gender in a way that is healthy? How do we think about the narratives and the stories that we tell in a way that moves towards partnership? So I think starting there, because she then does talk a lot about domestic violence, most of her work is around that. So I think that's a good point for people to start getting some of the general ideas and start understanding like why talking about these things is really important. And then you can kind of get into the more things that can be more difficult to start moving into, but kind of have a good foundation of where do we want to go to? What do we want to, what kind of goal do we want to reach? Because I think that that partnership idea of we're all working together, we're all in kinship together, I think that really is ultimately a lot of what prevention's goal is. So I like her a lot, and she's really fun to listen to too.
Do you mind putting that resource in the chat, Lex? Awesome. Any other?
Yeah, Lex, I love that you brought up the goal, because I think one of the hardest things about prevention work, as I think a number of the comments we've made have gotten at, is that it's really hard to figure out where to start. And I think a lot of people feel a lot of anticipatory anxiety about like what does this mean? And it's really easy to get kind of like bogged down in the complexity of right now and not know where to start, right? And just get that like, ugh, well, how feeling. And so I think if you start with like, well, what do you want to do to prevent violence? It's like, oof. And often people will reach for like the easiest solutions and then like not really necessarily be invested in them in the same way. I'm like, oh, okay, well, we'll get a curriculum, which they're great curricula, but like for what purpose? What's the goal? And so one of the, I think, most productive conversations I've ever had is when I get to talk to people about like, what's the future that we can collectively envision? Like, what do we want? What does it mean to have a future without violence? Like, what does that world look like? And if we start there, then we can kind of like backfill in a really different way, right? If you're talking to people about like violence prevention, they might be like, well, we need more police patrols. But then if you're like, well, what does a future that doesn't need those things look like? It's like, well, everyone would have a house. Okay, let's do economic justice work. Or like, well, people would be nicer to each other. Okay, like, how do we get there? I think those are the conversations that are really fruitful. And that's when we're looking at prevention, not just as like preventing something bad from happening, but looking at it as transforming, right? Like, this is about transformative justice. This is about looking at the world and saying, what could it be? And those are also the conversations, I think, that help us resist despair and that help us get into a place of like activation instead of a place of shutdown. So, you know, I assume most people on this call would probably consider what they do to be part of like the trauma field, right? We're all really good at working with folks in trauma. We understand how the brain reacts to trauma and how hard it is to act often. So finding that way to not reify those traumatic states and instead to look at the hopefulness and the potential in the future is what really gets me excited.
Every time, Martina, I feel like I'm like, I have a thought. And then you say it in such a beautiful way that I'm honestly so glad you said it first, because mine would come out all kind of staggered. Really beautiful. I mean, like, that's exactly it, right? Like, our roles are not to necessarily be out here saying, this is violence, this is bad. I think we've seen the repercussions of doing that work for years. We're seeing all these youth activated right now about like, look at all these injustices that are happening, or I've experienced harm, you should do something about that. And they're not seeing the justice, they're not seeing people doing anything or making change about that. And it's frustrating. And that's because we've spent the last so many years of prevention saying, if this is domestic violence or this is this, and if this happens to you, it's not good. And you should do something about that, right? And we haven't said, how can we build healthy relationships, or how can we talk about promoting what is good, or finding justice too in those moments. We haven't put our stock in that. And so I think we need to start building that to that question of, what does it look like to be violence free in this world, and what strategies do we need to take to get there? And I think it's just really great to see how people from all different fields of work, but also like community members are doing prevention already. As we've spoken to so much already, people are often already doing it. So I think like addressing that apprehension is by saying like, oh wow, like just in talking to you, I've already noticed these things you're already doing. It's fantastic. I mean, I'm looking at several people on this call that I've worked with, and it's like you're in different fields and are doing the work. Like, so I think just like acknowledging that and can really like ease people's apprehension. And of course, my organized brain would love to map all of the people doing prevention all across my community. Like sometimes I think about sitting down and doing it, and I'm like, it would be too much because there are so many people activated doing this work right now in different ways, and it looks so different. And so just like knowing and telling people, finding your little piece of it, and what makes sense for you, whether it's at an individual level of prevention or an institutional or a societal level of prevention, just like finding where that is for you, and what main things that are important to your community, and starting there and being okay with not being the one size fits all solution for every single person in our community. I think that's what people are so afraid of. And we see that with these curricula. They try and like make it so they fit for every single person. There's just no way. There's no way you can do that. And so being comfortable with that discomfort of everybody gets the same treatment, that instead of equality, that equity work being centered. Yeah.
Eli, before I pass us back to Lee to close us out, did you have a final thought you wanted to share? No pressure. You were just the only.
Yeah, my brain's just sitting in happiness of all the pieces that were just shared. So I think I'm good for now.
So thank you, everybody, and I'll pass it back to Lee to close us out.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here, everybody. And thank you so much to all of our wonderful speakers. We will be sending a link out to the recording after this. I'm sure you'll want to forward it on to all your coworkers because this was really a fantastic talk. So many takeaways. So we'll release you off into your Friday and your weekend, and hopefully it's a long weekend for you. And again, thank you so much for being here.